Thank you, Court. Thank you for all you and Rachel have done this year for putting together this year's conference. I look forward to hopefully seeing everyone in person before that much longer. But it's both my pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker this year, my doctoral advisor and director, John Nolt. Dr. Nolt is now Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's authored or edited 8 academic books, including Down to Earth Toward a Philosophy of Nonviolent Living and Environmental Ethics for the Long Term. His latest book, In Comparable Values, Analysis, Axiomates, and Applications, is forthcoming through Routledge Press. In addition to his outstanding scholarship, Dr. Nolt is a devoted activist who has worked on behalf of environmental causes and nuclear weapons disarmament for more than 3 decades now. Ultimately, as a philosopher, I found John Nolt to be the absolute personification of the concern for peace. When I began PhD work in Tennessee, I had no idea at that time that there are actual academic philosophers focused on advancing Gandhian principles of nonviolence and simplicity. It was through my encounter with John Nolt that I can say I found my own purpose and place in philosophy. Today, Dr. Nolt will speak on biocentric ethics, a topic at the intersection of nonviolence and environmental ethics. I look forward to what will surely be a stimulating and insightful keynote address. So with that, I turn things over to John Nolt. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that introduction. And it's always wonderful to see you again, because you are one of my students who I think most highly of, and you've gone on and done some great things. And so I very much appreciate your being here and being able to introduce me. My talk is going to contain a bunch of ideas. It goes by pretty quickly. Many of these are ideas that I've talked about elsewhere and published. And I'm going to try to put them all together and get a really big picture view by combining them. Ultimately, I think all this stuff is going to wind up being a book. So I won't be able to get it all in, but we'll see how it goes tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint. See if this works. There we go. That looks like it. Everybody see this all right? It's okay?
Yes,
all right.
That's good.
Okay, here we go. Year by year, our expanding population, land appropriation, and fossil fuel-powered lifestyles render this planet less habitable for most non-human living things, and for many human beings as well. Perhaps the most urgent question facing humanity today is, how can we become less destructive? I think that one way, perhaps the only hopeful and nonviolent way, is to cultivate and practice an unusually broad and objective ethic, an ethic that attends not just to current human events, but to the distant future and to the welfare of all living things, a long-term biocentric ethic. The need for such an ethic is evident in the magnitude and probable duration of the 2 greatest contemporary environmental crises: anthropogenic climate change and accelerating biodiversity loss. First, climate change. We've already, largely by the burning of fossil fuels, elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide to its highest level in the last 800,000 years, warming the troposphere and oceans, melting glaciers, tundra, and polar ice, raising sea levels, extending the range of tropical diseases, empowering extreme storms, heat waves, cold snaps, droughts, crop failures, wildfires, floods, and intensified hurricanes. Estimates of the present and near-term human death toll attributable to climate change are in the hundreds of thousands annually, and there are 4 different studies that I'm listing here, all of which put that figure in the hundreds of thousands annually, globally. Not included in these estimates are the suffering and loss of life that occur among the many waves of migrants hoping to escape the poverty and violence that have themselves been exacerbated by climate change. The duration and scale of the harms of climate change transcend anything contemplated by traditional ethical theories. They vanish or fade when the causes, most familiar harms are one-time effects of one-time causes. They vanish or fade when the causes cease to operate. But the effects of carbon emissions linger long after the emissions have ceased, and the cumulative toll of deaths, injuries, and extinctions mounts year by year. Even if current human mortality rates do not increase, climate change will have killed tens of millions of people by the end of the century, as John Broome notes. You just extrapolate from these figures and you get that. But the rates are increasing. The damage, moreover, will not cease in 2100. Even after we finally manage to halt carbon emissions, elevated CO2 levels will persist for centuries. And there's a study in 2009, in which this conclusion is reached. The models presented here give a broadly coherent picture of fossil fuel releases into the atmosphere. Equilibration with the ocean will absorb most of it in a time scale of 2 to 20 centuries, 200 to 2,000 years. But the remaining CO2 is abundant enough to continue to have a substantial effect on climate for thousands of years. And this final line really says it. Nowhere in the model results or the published literature is there any reason to conclude that the effects of CO2 release will be substantially confined to just a few centuries. In contrast, generally accepted modern understanding of the global carbon cycle indicates that the climate effects of CO2 releases to the atmosphere will persist for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years into the future. Now, this is an article which surveyed all the studies done up until that time of atmospheric CO2. Here's a somewhat more recent article, which really looks at a worst case scenario, 2.5 trillion metric tons over the next 500 years. But that's a scenario that is well within the path that we are taking because we're not meeting our climate goals. And so this is a possible scenario. And what you see is a rise in temperature of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, in the worst case 6. And then a plateau. And notice there's a change of scale in the middle there. That's where the scale changes. And it goes out to 10,000 years. And still at 10,000 years, the temperature is elevated. The reason for that is because of long-term climate feedbacks that are listed here, various kinds of things, and I won't go into all the details. But the bottom line is that the duration that they foresee for elevated temperature as a result of what we are doing now and could be doing in the next few hundred years is 2,300 to 165,000 years. This is from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The damage of CO2, moreover, our emissions, is not limited merely to the effects of temperature increase. High levels of atmospheric CO2 acidify the oceans, reducing or eliminating populations of marine organisms such as shellfish and corals that construct calcium carbonate skeletons or shells. So that what happens, carbon dioxide gets dissolved in the oceans, it becomes carbonic acid. The acid eats away at shells. So here's what a healthy coral reef looks like. Here's what happens after you increase the temperature and turn up the acid. And that's called a coral bleaching event. 2018 study concluded that top tropical reef systems are transitioning to a new era in which the interval between recurrent bouts of coral bleaching is too short for full recovery of the assemblages. When you get that, you can't get back to this. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, coral reefs will succumb quickly if temperature increases reach even the lowest end of current estimates, which is 1.5 degrees centigrade. At that level, 70 to 90% of the coral reefs will be lost. If it goes to 2 degrees C, it's over 99%. Current commitments by the nations for carbon dioxide levels, if you project it out to the end of the century, only get us to 2.7 degrees. So if we don't do better, we're not going to have coral reefs by the end of the century. Again, the damage is long-term. In 2009, nearly all the world's academies of science, and there are over 100 of these in 100 different nations, more than 100 different nations, issued a report warning that ocean acidification, here's the statement, outlined, ocean acidification is irreversible on timescales of at least tens of thousands of years. Once you get the acid in, nothing will get rid of it for that long a time. Geoengineering schemes that merely reduce the temperature, so if we're talking about sulfate aerosols or big mirrors in space or something like that, would do nothing to solve the ocean acidification problem. Other geoengineering schemes might. Some people have talked about dumping calcium carbonate into the ocean, things like that. But again, with unintended and unpredictable consequences. Then there's the violence induced by climate change. While we're at this meeting to discuss peace, military establishments worldwide are preparing for violent climate change-induced conflict. Conflict over the oil and gas resources that will become accessible in the Arctic as the North Polar ice cap melts. Conflict as masses of people displaced by sea level rise, heat, thirst, and hunger seek to migrate to more temperate regions, and ultimately perhaps even conflict over which nations will control the geoengineering of the atmosphere. That's one crisis. That's the first. It's very long-term. Biodiversity loss is also a very long-term crisis. Biodiversity loss has many causes, but climate change and ocean acidification are both high on the list. I've already mentioned degradation of the coral reefs, but biodiversity loss is planet-wide. Causes include not only climate change and ocean acidification, but also worldwide transport, intentional or not, of invasive organisms and disease vectors, overexploitation of food species, pollution of many kinds, habitat destruction, especially deforestation in the tropics. A recent study by Sabalos et al. They looked at a bunch of different classifications of species. These are their maps for loss of populations in mammals. And the bottom line here is in yellow. Large regions in all continents have lost 50% or more of the populations of evaluated mammals. What they did was they picked 177 mammal species that they had data on, good data, and they mapped them here. And where you see the dark or light blue on the maps, those areas have lost 50% or more of their populations of mammals. The dark blue is actually more than 75%. So you see a tremendous decline in populations of all kinds of animals. In this case, we're just looking at mammals. Let's look at insects. So this is a different study in 2019, which lists a number of different categories of insects. Let's look at butterflies over here. So the gray area is those butterfly species that are already known to have gone extinct. The orange area is the endangered ones, the ones that are in immediate danger of going extinct. Orange is vulnerable, and 30% they're declining, but they're not vulnerable yet. So if we take a look at this, the top of the chart is 100%. This is 60% of the butterfly species are declining. Some of them already extinct. And the picture differs for different categories, but for some, dung beetles, for example, it's they're pretty close to extinction. I mean, once you well, that's probably not true. These are the extinct ones, but they're in a lot of trouble, you can see. So we also know something from paleontological studies of when the planet has heated in the past. And these take a look at fossil data during those periods. And what these studies show, and they're all over the map, but they average them all together. And what they show is this kind of smooth accelerating curve. As the temperature goes up, you get more extinctions. So we can expect more extinctions because we know the temperature is going to go up. And so you have a lot of biologists today who are beginning to warn that we may be precipitating the Earth's sixth mass extinction. A mass extinction is an episode in which more than 3/4 of all species are lost in a geologically short interval. There have been 5 of them over the last 500 million years. The 5th occurred 66 million years ago when a 6-mile-wide asteroid plowed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. That was what the asteroid that eliminated all the dinosaurs except for the birds. So there's an artist's rendition of what it might have looked like from space to have an asteroid hit the Earth. You can see the spreading out of massive tidal waves from that impact that went all around the world and impacted even deep into continents where they were overrun by the tidal waves, and then worldwide forest fires and all kinds of other things that created havoc across the planet. That was the 5th mass extinction, and there's an artist's rendition. Of course, these are both just artist renditions. We don't have any photographs, obviously. That's an artist's rendition of what the Earth might have looked like in a year or two after the asteroid impact. Now, today's anthropogenic extinctions are much smaller. We're not anywhere near this. Only a few percent of species assessed have gone extinct. They do not add up to anything like mass extinction yet. But when you look at those maps of the population declines, and you combine that with evidence from past warming events, we certainly get a prediction of an upsurge of extinctions over the next couple of centuries. Extrapolating from the trends, Barnowski et al., whom I quoted earlier, conclude that a 6th mass extinction event, there's what they actually say, could be accomplished within a few centuries. And on the right there, you see the 5 different mass extinctions, the ones that we've had already. So a couple of centuries, and we could be in that same kind of a situation where we've lost 75% of the species on the planet. Oops, I don't want to go there yet. Let's leave that up. There we go. In sum, the harm we are doing to life on Earth may, within a few centuries, rival that of an asteroid impact. Current infrastructure commitments and the trajectories of population growth and resource consumption ensure additional harm. And once again, the potential duration of the scale of the harm that we're doing transcends anything contemplated by traditional ethical theories. Yet, the inevitability of great destruction is hardly reason to acquiesce to still greater destruction. We can reduce future damage considerably. We might even still prevent runaway climate change or a mass extinction. Such hopes motivate and give urgency to the creation of long-term biocentric ethics. So what does a long-term biocentric ethic look like? It need not, as the name might suggest, push humanistic ethics to the periphery. This is biocentric, but biocentric includes humans. We are biological creatures too, and of an extraordinarily valuable kind. Nor needs such an ethic reduce existing responsibilities to our fellow humans, but it does demand more attention, more extensive attention to our fellow creatures. The scope of an ethic is determined by its criterion of moral considerability or moral patienthood. I use these two terms synonymously. Moral patients are those to whom or to which we have some responsibilities, some moral responsibilities. Anthropocentric ethics regard only members of Homo sapiens as moral patients. Non-anthropocentric theories posit responsibilities to at least some non-humans. According to biocentric ethics, which is what I'm advocating in this paper, we have some responsibility for the welfare of all life on Earth. Ethics also have different temporal scopes. Short-term ethics regard only our contemporaries as moral patients. Long-term ethics recognize that we have responsibilities to those who will live after, sometimes long after, we have died. In general, moral responsibilities are of two kinds, those that spring from special relationships and those that are owed to moral patients per se. The responsibilities that parents have to their children or that spouses, friends, or co-workers have to one another are rooted in special relationships. But the responsibilities that we all have not to wantonly kill, injure, or steal from other people, even strangers, spring just from their status as moral patients. The novel responsibilities introduced by long-term biocentric ethics are predominantly, if not exclusively, of this latter kind. They stem just from the moral considerability of the beings that we're talking about. Now, despite the differences concerning scope of moral considerability, and despite their ideological differences in all kinds of ways, ethical theories seem to concur on this simple and somewhat abstract principle of non-harm. It's wrong to harm moral patients without adequate justification. Now, of course, what counts as adequate justification is going to depend on your theory, but there are points of near universal consensus. Virtually all moral theories, for example, permit harm in self-defense. For consequentialist theories, harm is justified only if it prevents greater harm or produces greater good. For deontological theories, justification is typically inferred from moral principles that specify duties of respect. Harm itself is roughly welfare reduction. There are many ways to harm, but causing suffering, loss of health, and death are paradigms. And these are the only kinds of harms I'm going to consider here. Suffering, loss of health, and death. Those are obviously among the most serious of harms. Only sentient beings, of course, can suffer, but loss of health and death can be inflicted upon anything that lives. All three kinds of harm are objective and empirically accessible matters of fact. They don't depend on our opinions. The principle of non-harm, of course, has limits. It would be pointless, for example, to posit responsibilities of non-harm to beings that we cannot in any knowing way affect. Those too far from us in space or time, for example. And historically, this has meant that our responsibilities of non-harm were limited to our spatiotemporal and mainly human neighbors. But the technological expansion of human knowledge and power have loosened these limits, both toward the future and toward our more distant relatives. Expanding technological power requires expanding moral responsibility. But how does the principle of non-harm function in long-term and biocentric ethics? Consider the long-term first. Fundamental to long-term ethics is the principle that moral considerability is spatio-temporally invariant. That is, it does not diminish with distance from us, either in space or in time. Given, for example, that individual people are equally morally considerable, inflicting unjustified harm upon a stranger 1,000 years from now is just as wrong as inflicting the same unjustified harm on a stranger today. More generally, the moral considerability of similar moral patients is similar, regardless of where or when they live. Futurity per se does not affect moral considerability because it's fundamentally a matter of perspective. Temporal terms like present and future do not describe intrinsic properties of either things or events. They're indexicals that indicate how the time they describe is related to the time at which they are uttered. In this way, they resemble the spatial terms here and there. Saying that a thing or event is here signals that it exists or occurs in the speaker's vicinity. Saying that it is there signals that it exists or occurs at some distance from the speaker. Similarly, saying that a thing or event is present signals that it occurs or exists at the time of utterance. And saying that it is future indicates that it exists or occurs later. Just as distant people think of themselves as here and us as there, so did our predecessors think of us, if they thought of us at all, as future and themselves as present. But we're obviously morally considerable. The difference in each case resides in the relation of the speaker's viewpoint to the spatial or temporal locations of the things or events mentioned. And this has no rationally defensible bearing on the moral considerability of those things or events. Now, people tend to assume that because we're here, we're present, we exist here, our moral value is greater than that of future people, just as it may seem that because we are here in our nation, for example, we're more morally considerable than people who are there, those foreigners. And of course, the foreigners are likely to take the opposite view. But both their beliefs and ours, if founded solely on nothing more than these perspectival differences, are mere parochial biases. Similarly, if our predecessors thought of their successors, including us, as future, and for that reason less morally considerable than themselves, they were mistaken. And if we think of our successors as less morally considerable than we are likewise mistaken. Only our mistake is worse, for we, with vast out of sight, out of mind technologies, can harm our successors in ways that our predecessors could never have harmed us. Do long-term ethics then really imply that we have responsibilities to unknown individuals who do not yet even exist? Of course. Just as prospective parents ought to prepare a good home for their future children who are unknown to them, so we collectively ought to leave a habitable earth for our successors who are unknown to us. Since futurity per se does not affect moral considerability, it provides no reason to discount our responsibilities to those who come after us. No reason, that is, to think that our responsibilities of non-harm to strangers, both contemporary and future, are the same. But when we're talking about the future, doesn't probability enter into this? Don't our responsibilities diminish to the extent that the prospective harms are improbable? Yes, they do. It's rational to consider risks in proportion to their probability. But the probability of future events does not generally decrease with their futurity. Think of intense hurricanes, for example, in the 2030s. They're much more probable than they are now. Probability in that case increases with futurity. There is in fact no regular correlation between probability and futurity. What does regularly increase with distance into the future is our ignorance. But it is a dangerous blunder to conflate ignorance with low probability, for that leads us to underestimate future risks. Given human equality and the temporal invariance of moral considerability, an action with a certain known probability of killing someone in 100 years is just as wrong as an action with that same known probability of killing a person today. And this claim, by the way, is not idle, for even relatively small personal carbon emissions now increase the probability of additional death and injury over the coming millennia. So they are not morally negligible. Our personal emissions are not morally negligible for this reason. I've written extensively on this if you want to look it up. The harm we're doing, of course, is unintended, a side effect of our growing population, land use and fossil fuel powered lifestyles. But it is not blind. Denial is a thin veneer. In its stubborn obstinacy, it betrays itself. Just as the duration of the harm we are doing to the future suggests a need for long-term ethics, so the depth and breadth of the harm we are doing to our fellow creatures suggests a need for a biocentric ethic. It is widely acknowledged that all living organisms have goods of their own independently of our judgment or cognition. Things can, in other words, go better or worse for them as a matter of fact. They can be objectively benefited or harmed, even if they're not aware of this. There's a tree outside my window that can be objectively benefited or harmed, even though it's probably not sentient. Each organism, for example, thrives best within certain ranges of temperature and moisture and with the availability of certain nutrients. And each can be harmed by excessive heat, ionizing radiation, desiccation, and disease. The extent to which things go well or badly for an organism is the degree of its welfare. It is harmed to the extent that its welfare is diminished. The most familiar sort of welfare, of course, is ours. So what's good for humans? Well, preference utilitarians, including neoclassical economists, maintain that the good is preference satisfaction. But in fact, preference satisfaction is only loosely correlated with human welfare. There are at least three reasons for this. First, due to outmoded genetic predispositions, like our desire for sweets and fats in excess. And also to propaganda and advertising, we often prefer, and upon reflection, continue to prefer what is not good for us. Second, too much preference satisfaction may leave us bored and our lives devoid of meaning. And third, sometimes things that we prefer to avoid are actually good for us. And I think you can all think of examples of that. Interestingly, this is also true, by the way, for non-humans. Nicholas Agar's 2001 book, Life's Intrinsic Value, for example, attempts to generalize a preference satisfaction account of welfare via what he calls biopreferences, we might call them instincts, to all living things. But that book flounders on one of the same problems that bedevils preference satisfaction accounts for humans. Many creatures have instinctive biopreferences whose satisfaction in our remade world is maladaptive and bad for them. I remember when I was a kid, at night when the streetlights came on, you'd look up and there would be clouds of moths around them, circling around them. Why were they doing that? Well, they used to guide their flight by the moon, and the moon was the only bright light at night. The streetlights changed all that, and I look out at night now, I don't see those moths, and I think we've probably lost them because they were not very well adapted to a streetlight environment. So we've changed the world in ways that are not good for the biological preferences of either us or of many creatures. There is, however, one objective good, not only for humans, but for all living things, both present and future. That's health. Definitions of health vary, of course, but they all center around the integrity of bodily function. This is not a precise idea, and certainly the criteria of health vary from species to species, but it applies pretty obviously across the entire range of living things. At that level of generality, we may reasonably think of it as biotic welfare. So we're looking at the range of living things. There's some cyanobacteria on the left in a breaching whale. which is a much more complex organism on the right. And we see a vast range there. Biotic welfare declines when an organism becomes ill or injured. It's minimal or zero level, which is the same for all organisms. It's complete cessation of bodily function. In other words, death. Complex organisms having greater levels of functional integration generally have more biotic welfare than simple ones do. So we expect a whale is going to have an astronomical level of biotic welfare compared to, say, a bacterium. The biotic welfare of a healthy human is therefore high relative to that of less complex organisms, and it's utterly astronomical relative to that of microorganisms. Biotic welfare, or we might call it health, may be the only kind of welfare that non-sentient organisms have. But for humans and for sentient animals generally, moments of pleasure enhance life's goodness, and intervals of intense or prolonged suffering detract from it. Hence, a sentient animal also at a given time has a certain level of hedonic welfare, that is roughly pleasure and the absence of pain. And here you see this pretty graphically depicted. Those three dogs on the left are having a good time. They're obviously quite enjoying themselves. That lion is starving and is suffering. Though biotic and hedonic welfare are often correlated, they are factually and conceptually distinct. Unlike biotic welfare, which is always positive, or in the case of death, zero, hedonic welfare is negative when suffering predominates, as with the lion, and positive when pleasure predominates, as with these dogs. It is zero when both are absent, as in unconsciousness or death, and perhaps when they're equally balanced, though that may take an unlikely amount of fine-tuning. Though it may be more difficult to assess than biotic welfare, hedonic welfare is no less objective. If a sentient individual is feeling well or suffering, that is a fact independent of our cognition. That lion feels bad, the dogs feel good, and it doesn't matter what we think about it. The objective welfare of sentient animals is also complex, having both biotic and hedonic components. Sentient animals generally fare well insofar as they're physically fit and feeling fine. But human welfare is still more complex and demanding, since it has also cultural dimensions. Things like freedom from oppression or meaningful work are essential to human welfare. And no doubt other dimensions as well, but these social dimensions of welfare may be absent or largely so from many non-humans. Biotic welfare, hedonic welfare, and whatever other objective conditions add to life's goodness can be combined into what is called an objective list conception of welfare. Such a conception is objective enough for long-term ethics and potentially broad enough in scope for biocentrism. Although biotic and hedonic welfare are distinct dimensions of it, we may nevertheless conceive it as a single invariable good that is embodied in different ways in different individuals, not all of whom possess all of its dimensions. The source of the unity of this concept is the fact that its different dimensions can all have an absolute zero level. Death is the absolute zero of biotic welfare. There's a middle zero in the case of hedonic welfare, and you can also find absolute zeros for most of these other notions that constitute welfare. So now picture it like a set of Cartesian coordinates that all meet at the zero in the middle. And you've got a single concept, a single construct that embodies all these notions of welfare and interrelates them. Assuming, as is reasonable, that the zeros are absolute, and that means what that means is they represent a complete absence of the welfare of any kind. We can identify them and thereby combine the separate dimensions into a single multidimensional welfare concept. Such a unified multidimensional welfare concept can alleviate some of the comparison problems that arise when moral considerability is extended to such a wide multiplicity of life forms. It can even make comparison possible across dimensions of welfare. Any negative level of hedonic welfare, for example, the lion once again, is less than any level of biotic welfare, which is always positive or zero. Welfare comparisons can therefore sometimes be made between sentient and non-sentient organisms. Healthy sentient animals generally have more welfare overall than non-sentient organisms, since their hedonic welfare can be positive and the hedonic welfare of non-sentient organisms is zero. And since sentient animals tend to have more complex functional integration, that is health, greater degree of health or greater quantity of health, you might say. Yet not all welfare levels are comparable. In general, two values are comparable if and only if each is either less than or greater than or equal to the other. Values, any two of which are comparable, are said to be linearly ordered. This is our normal conception of value. Everybody kind of thinks of this. You have a scale, it's got degrees on it, it goes from better to worse. Those are linearly ordered values. And you can have these, but I think most of our conceptions of welfare are more complex than that. So there's a fourth possibility. Each of two values may be neither that less than, nor equal to, nor greater than the other. In that case, the two are incomparable. A simple way of thinking about incomparability is that it's value difference, they're not equal, but without superiority, neither is better. Values, some of which are incomparable, are merely partially ordered, and they take a very different form. So they form a kind of network like this. This diagram can be understood as follows. Any of the dots represent values, and any two values connected by lines are comparable if one of them is higher than the other. So if you can trace a path from one down to the other through the lines, there's comparability. But if there are no lines connecting two values, then they're incomparable. So you wind up with a network of values, some of which are comparable and some are not. And my contention is that if we look at complex welfare values, they're going to look like this. They're not going to be linearly ordered. So in unified multidimensional value structures, some welfare value pairs are comparable and some are not. If one organism has more biotic welfare and at least as much hedonic welfare as another, for example, then its welfare is greater. But if one has more biotic welfare than the other, but less hedonic welfare, or vice versa, then the degrees of their overall welfare may be incomparable. In general, then, degrees of overall welfare are not linearly ordered, but merely partially ordered. Their comparison structure is not a line, but a network. Yet, even when welfare values of organisms are incomparable, they never differ infinitely. I've written about this in a good bit more detail, but here's a quick summary of the argument for that claim. Oh, and there's the book in which you can find all this stuff about incomparable values. It'll be out at the end of the year. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. Here's the argument that there are no infinite welfare differences among living things, even though some of the differences are incomparable. We know first that any two living organisms share a common ancestor, at least on Earth. There are other planets, that's not true, but any two living organisms here on Earth share a common ancestor, that's well known. And there are only finitely many reproductive steps between any earthly organism and any of its ancestors, because there's only been a finite amount of time and reproduction takes time. Furthermore, offspring are enough like their parents so that at no reproductive step could there have been an infinite welfare difference between the parent and the offspring. You're not going to get an infinite welfare difference between one organism and its offspring. That's just not going to happen in any case. Now, it's a principle of mathematics that the sum of a finite number of non-infinite welfare differences cannot be infinite. So if we got a finite number of steps from ancestor to current organism, and each of those steps is finite, then the difference in welfare between the ancestor and the current organism can't be infinite. So the welfare difference between any organism and any of its ancestors is not infinite. And so now, one further step, consider any two organisms, X and Y. Since X and Y have a common ancestor, we can trace both back to some common ancestor, at least in principle. And the welfare difference between each of X and Y and this common ancestor is not infinite. So if I go from X to the common ancestor, there's not an infinite difference there. And if I go from Y to the common ancestor, there's not an infinite difference. Then the welfare difference between X and Y themselves cannot be infinite. Why? Well, you just take the difference between X and the common ancestor and add that to the difference between Y and the common ancestor, and you get the difference between X and Y. And those are both finite, and so it's got to be non-infinite. Now, there's a lot more to this. This is just a quick summary of an argument that takes a lot more fleshing out, but you can find the details here or in the forthcoming book that I mentioned. So there's a reference. Again, though no two organisms have welfare levels that are infinitely different, however, they can have welfare levels that are incomparable. Now, this is a purely axiological, that is, value theoretic conclusion. By itself, it has no ethical implications. But if we grant some moral consideration to the welfare of any living being, it suggests that although your moral considerability, or mine, is astronomically greater than the moral considerability of a microorganism, neither yours nor mine is infinitely greater than a microorganism. Every living thing counts to some finite, even if small, extent. We may then think of the total objective welfare of individual organisms on Earth. That would be huge. We couldn't do it, but it would be. But we can imagine it. So we may think of that as the sum of welfare values for each organism at that time. There's, of course, no way to track welfare for individual organisms worldwide, but conservation biologists already know much about how things are going at the species level. It's not unreasonable to see the current biodiversity losses as evidence that the general welfare of life on Earth is in decline. That is, the general goodness for life is diminishing. Still, it is a mistake to equate biodiversity with high welfare. The two concepts are importantly distinct. Only functionally very complex organisms can individually have very high welfare values. Bacteria can't. Biodiversity could therefore be high, for example, in a world with an immense variety of microorganisms, each of which has such low welfare that the overall welfare would nevertheless be pretty low. Since welfare is objective goodness for the organism, aggregate welfare would give us a much better measure than biodiversity of how much of the Earth's objective goodness we are losing as we lose biodiversity. Therefore, assuming that the goal of ethics is to promote the good, aggregate welfare is probably of greater ethical importance than is biodiversity, which is not to say that biodiversity is in any way unimportant. What I'm saying is that if we want to think of the moral significance of what we're doing, look at the loss of welfare and you get a better picture than looking at the loss of biodiversity. I noted earlier that even microorganisms have some finite, though utterly minuscule level of biotic welfare. Given the principle of non-harm, does that mean that we may not harm microbes without justification? No, that doesn't follow. We may consistently admit that they have objective welfare and yet deny that they're morally considerable. Lack of moral considerability would exempt them from the principle of non-harm. Many non-anthropocentrists, even non-anthropocentrists like Peter Singer, limit moral considerability in this way just to the sentient animals, those that can experience pleasure or suffering. For such sentientists, biotic welfare per se is not morally valuable. It matters only insofar as it affects conscious experience. So, it matters for critters like that. But there's a sense, a developmental sense, in which this is backward. Non-sentient organisms, and I assume that plants are non-sentient, so all the organisms that you see in this picture, non-sentient organisms were here long before sentient organisms appeared. Sentience evolved from non-sentient organisms because abilities to feel pleasure and pain facilitate associative learning in ways that tend to promote health, survival, and reproduction. The original biological role of sentience is therefore to promote those more fundamental and ancient aims. Now, I'm not going to argue that makes them that matters morally, but I'm going to suggest that it could lead us to ask whether health's goodness resides merely in its effects on consciousness. If health, for example, is an independent and more original element of welfare, then why should it cease to matter morally when unaccompanied by conscious experience? In the absence of a compelling answer to this question, and I've never heard one, a very broad biocentrism remains an open possibility. Living things, both sentient and non-sentient, can, of course, be morally considerable without being equally morally considerable. And the best biocentric ethics allow for immense variation in moral importance. We grant moral considerability to a single yeast cell, for example. It should obviously be utterly minuscule relative to that of a redwood tree or a lemur, although not infinitely less. Single-celled yeasts probably have appreciable moral considerability only in very large aggregates, such as entire species, and those species' ecological importance to other species. Degrees of moral considerability could, moreover, like degrees of welfare, be merely partially ordered, so things get quite complicated. But then, of course, we want to ask, so who's right? Is it the sentientists, assuming in non-anthropocentrism, is it the sentientists or the biocentrists? Well, I doubt that this is a useful question. Criteria of moral consideration, although subject to rational criticism, are not in any clearly discernible way written into the nature of things. They are, however, norms that we collectively develop to adjust our behavior to our unfolding predicaments. Choose them as to shape what humanity will become. Instead of asking which, and more insightfully ask, what shall we become? Our current predicament is to be perpetrators of great and enduring harms to life on earth. Extending moral consideration to many, if not all, of our fellow creatures, far into the future, could help us break old habits and become less destructive. It's easiest, of course, to extend moral consideration to sentient beings like our friend the raccoon over here, since, as editors of conservation magazines all know, sentient charismatic megafauna readily engage our sympathies. But there may be still greater virtue in extending moral consideration to all life. So let's take the broad picture just for now. In extending moral consideration that far, there may be the benefit of greater hope. Genuine moral concern for others is self-transcendence. We're self-transcendent toward something to the extent that we value its welfare as an end, not merely as a means. We can thus hope for its good as well as for ours. Since we will die, we can have no long-run realistic earthly hope for ourselves. But self-transcendence toward others enables us to have realistic hope, even as we approach death, for those others. Of course, they too are short-lived, so that hope only takes us so far. If, however, our self-transcendence is very wide, incorporating non-human life over broad spans of time, then we can enlarge our realistic hope, and in doing so, make that hope more enduring and sustainable. Broad and long-term self-transcendence, in other words, makes realistic hope possible, realistic long-term hope possible. Now, after I've talked about all the calamities that we're causing, this may seem ludicrous. Given the depths of the tragedies to come, why should we think that? But to think that way is to underestimate life's resilience. Life on Earth has already successfully overcome 5 mass extinctions, returning each time more lavishly biodiverse than before. Those 5 tragedies were not the end. Life likely will in some form continue to flourish, if not forever, for longer than we can imagine. How long then is the long term? Ethics aims to guide action toward the good. It has no application beyond what we can knowingly and with some reliability affect. But that is now the entire Earth for millions of years, the recovery time from mass extinctions. We have that much power. Beyond that, ethics has no dominion. Short of that, I see no defensible bound for it. Humans may not last millions of years, and if we go extinct, so do human hopes. Nevertheless, we today can extend our current hopes to those who come after us, human or not, and there's some solace in that. That, I think, is the most far-sighted reason for making long-term ethics biocentric. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Arnold. I knew it was going to be insightful and stimulating. I see a couple of hands. Remember, you can also ask questions there in the chat feature. Leonard, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Thanks very much. And thank you for your talk. Really enjoyed it. Quick question about the no infinite welfare difference argument. So I wonder what happens if you add artificial life to the equation here. Artificial life wouldn't have common ancestors with say life like yours and mine.
Right.
It looks like it falls outside of the scope of the argument. Is there a supplementary move, or are you just not worried about artificial life?
Well, a way to go at artificial life, and that's to point out that really nothing that we can measure in the entire universe is infinite, comes to an infinite difference, and certainly nothing that we can produce could be infinitely greater than anything else. We're not infinity, it's not clear that there is anything infinite in the universe. That sort of argument could be used. It's a very different sort of argument, but I think it would be adequate to, if sufficiently rounded out, it would be adequate to rule out the possibility of artificial forms of life being infinitely greater, say, than natural forms.
Right. And quick follow-up, if I'm understanding correctly, that would sort of obviate the need for the argument that you did give, right? If there were simply no infinite differences, you wouldn't have to start with the first premise.
Right. But I take that to be a bit more contentious than the argument that I did give. So I think there's an epistemic gain in going at it the way that I did, even though I take that other argument to be also sound.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I thought I saw another hand. Was there someone else that had a question? Oh, Greg, go ahead.
Thank you, John. I think for many of us who don't work in this field and who are then reminded in such a succinct way as you did tonight, I don't know, I just feel like I've been hit by a lot of grief that I wasn't quite prepared for. And I think that's kind of what I'm working through in terms of ethics, is working ethically in a environment that's just saturated with this grief. How do you deal with that?
Great question. And I'm not sure that I have a fully adequate answer, but I teach environmental ethics, and I run into students all the time who are depressed and angry, rightly so. What I found with myself that works best is when I sometimes I feel depression, and other times I realize, and it was coming up just now, that's introjected anger, and I'm really angry. And I think the same is true of my students. And so I say, look, anger is really powerful. It's got a lot of energy. If you can channel that energy into activism, it'll be more hopeful. And so that's the advice I would give.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? I mean, certainly, I think many of us feel like we've been kind of hit with so much in this talk.
I didn't mean to like make a downer evening or something, but I think this stuff is really important.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Knoll, or Jen. Did you have something?
Jen, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just jump in?
Sure.
There's so much to think about. My brain is just like whirring, right?
Yeah.
But I think, I have a concern, right? Which is that when we broaden, right, in both of the ways that you're suggesting, I think one of the concerns is that we do like fall into a kind of long-termism that isn't necessarily hopeful, right? Not in the sense of like, I don't know, the sort of the human kind of hope, right? That like sort of that Rebecca de Solnit and folks like Kate Norlock are talking about, right? Where like to make sense of hope, we have to understand it on a human scale.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about sort of the ending where you were like, no, but there's hope. But I was like, what kind of hope is it? Is it the human kind of hope that I can get a grip on? Or is it kind of this long-termism, which might be hopeful for some organisms, but maybe not organisms like me?
Yeah. So I think there are both kinds. So I wouldn't put it as an either or. So what I see when I look around the world is that there are people everywhere who are working to save things. We're working to try to stop this. And in all those efforts, there's hope. In all of those efforts, there's hope. And that's short-term hope. I mean, we know that if we do things better than we're doing them now, we'll cause less harm. We're going to cause harm. There are tragedies to come. They're inevitable. They can't be stopped at this point, but we can ameliorate them. And there's hope in doing that. There's hope in working together to do that. And then there's also this kind of long-term hope, which is kind of almost a spiritual hope. It's like, well, even if we humans screw up really badly, life is going to continue. There are forces larger than we are. And I think that was what I was gesturing to at the end, but I don't mean to suggest that that's the only hope that we have. There are these short-term hopes that are realizable by people organizing and getting together and acting and doing constructive work.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Actually, if I might add, I remember in environmental ethics for the long haul, you make a point early in the book about how we can think of like environmental work as being sort of along the lines as historical preservation. Do you remember writing something like that? And
well, yeah, there's some talk of historical preservation in there. I think I was talking about the book by Andrew Light and others who make that argument, and I was commenting on it. Yeah.
okay, well, yeah, I just remember that it kind of put things in perspective. It was early in the book after you did make these points about life showing such great resilience, and also human beings being so adaptive and innovative, and basically not to focus on the wrong things, and to sort of think of the work overall as being like a kind of effort to preserve more than anything else.
Yeah, or to prevent future tragedies. I do really think, and my students' experience is something I've experienced, that if you find others to work with, and you actually get out and do some constructive work, that is a great way to handle anger and depression and all the other negative emotions that you get when you encounter this stuff. It's fun to be working with people, and it's hopeful to be working toward a goal that, even though there's bad things coming, that they won't be quite as bad because of something that you did.
Well, I would say that that's a good note to end on, it, unless anyone else has anything else they'd like to add. Okay, well, thank you for a great keynote address this year, Dr. Nolte.
Thank you all.
Yes, thanks, John. And gosh, brought me back to sitting through future generations with you and the those depressing charts.
I'm sorry.
No, it's motivating.
We're trying to be realistic here.
Yeah, no, it's motivating.
Yeah.
So thank you all.